my third point is that self-discipline is like a muscle. It takes practice. And so often we see the chores of parenting as just that. They're just draws, you know. But I'd invite you to see them as practice, you know. Mastering the little things is really important because it practices that muscle for when it will need to do a big effort, right? If you try to lift up a car, you know, from having never lifted anything, you won't be able to. But if you train every day, you might be able to lift up a car when you need. So the daily practice of that self-discipline muscle in the little things that seem pointless prepares us for the day when we'll have to apply a lot of self-discipline to one particular endeavor. If you are the ambitious kind, you might feel stuck in the day-to-day nitty-gritty, repetitive nature of the mundane, but try to see it as your practice for someday when you will be called to do something heroic and you'll have that strength of character and that practice, that muscle will be ready. It takes practice. And so what I found is that most spiritual backgrounds have daily practices that are also great practices for self-discipline. Like spiritual practices, they're like tiny workouts that you do that builds, once again, that discipline muscle. And so in our family, we go to church every Sunday. Every Sunday we go to church. And this is the first thing we place in our schedule. And if we're healthy enough to go anywhere, we go to church. But, and somebody once told me, like, you know, God will understand if you don't show up one Sunday. And I'm like, it's not about God, right? It's God's beyond whether I show up at church or not. I'm not doing this. He doesn't need me to show up for church. It's not about God. This is about me, right? It's about me and my family doing something over and over again that we may not feel like doing, that may not feel like it's giving us anything, you know, in terms of feeling. We know because we believe, but we may not feel it, right? Over and over again. And that's building, once again, that self-discipline muscle that is so important. In our spiritual practices, we often place ourselves under the rule of something that is bigger than we are. Every time you make the decision to do something, to get out of that lizard brain, right, and get your butt on a church pew, right? Like every time you make those decisions, it builds that habit. The gymnast who leaps through the air, who looks like a bird, you know, there's thousands of hours of conditioning tiny muscles and tiny little ligaments that if you don't condition, it's gonna break when you ask the bigger muscle. You know, if you ask your calf muscle to do something big, you can actually, but your ligaments haven't been trained, you can actually snap the ligament, like no matter how strong your calf muscle is. So those spiritual practices, what I find is that they're the practice of those tiny muscles that are required, that need to be conditioned, you know, for the day when a big effort is required. One of the spiritual practices that I find super useful as in instrumental to my ability to grow in self-discipline and self-mastery is accountability. So in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic tradition, there's two things that speak to that. The first tradition is a tradition of spiritual direction, and the second one is the practice of confession. And so, like I said, don't get bogged down on the Catholic stuff. Just dig the bigger idea here, right? Whether you believe in sin from a Christian perspective or not, in your life, there's certainly things that you do, habits that you have that you wish you didn't have. Like things that are keeping you from being the best person you know you can be, okay? So when I talk about sin, let's say that's what I'm talking about. okay? The things that prevent you from being the best person you can be, okay? And so this spiritual direction, your spiritual director in the Catholic tradition is somebody you trust, somebody you know, like this is somebody you ask usually, will you be my spiritual director? And with whom you are perfectly honest about the things that are keeping you from being the best person you can be. And that person will give you advice and say, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Maybe you're aiming too high. Maybe you should dial it down a little. And so this is somebody who helps you grow. It's also a big accountability check. So the second practice is the practice of confession. And that goes with the practice of the examination of conscience. And so if you're not Catholic, examination of conscience is a time that you spend every day, usually in the evening, where you go over your day and you highlight the things that you did that were sinful or not right or something that you struggle with, your struggles, etc. And so it's kind of like a gratitude journal, but it's the opposite. And then, like I said, once again, in the Catholic tradition, you have the practice of confession, which is going to a priest and telling him about the things you did wrong, basically. And so as Catholics, we believe that we get graces from the sacrament of penance. But if you're not Catholic and you're listening to that, that grace is that sort of that supernatural push. But even if you don't believe in supernatural pushes, you may believe in the practice of going to someone and telling him about the darkest corners of your soul, right? Like, once again, that's very liberating. And the nice thing about the priest who hears you in confession is that usually he doesn't buy your hype, right? Like, you can try to make sense and you can try to justify, but a good confessor will call you on your BS. That's so important, to have somebody who's able to have that sort of, like, even your spiritual director sometimes can be very friendly. Well, that's what I find. Like, I find my spiritual director she's very nice to me, right? She's very friendly. But a good confessor will just cut through that, if I'm starting to confess my husband's sin, well, I yelled at him, but, the priest will no, but, I don't want to hear what your husband's doing wrong, right? You can come and see me if you want to talk about that. There's also a lot of power in taking the same dark corners of your soul that you promised you would improve the last time back to the same person and said, since the last time we spoke, and over and over again. And then it starts being embarrassing. And then you don't want to go back. And then that's when you know it's working, right? You know it's working because you don't want to go back because you've been confessing the same thing and promising to improve and you're not, right? And then that's when the magic starts to happen. Find an accountability buddy, but it has to be somebody whom you can be brutally honest with and who will not buy your hype. Those are the conditions. This concludes my very long video on self-discipline, but you know what? It was all scripted. I could not make it shorter. Those were all things I thought were important to share with you. So I hope you enjoyed it, and even if you enjoyed it in bits and pieces, and I hope you'll come back